It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker to you this morning. Our guest speaker is James Otteson. He comes to us from Wake Forest University, where he's a professor of economics. He's also the executive director of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism and the executive director of a new institute called the Eudaimonia Institute. You students of Greek will know that eudaimonia refers to the human flourishing, and this new institute was just funded with an $8 million grant last year. So there are a lot of people out there who think that what Professor Otteson has to say is significant and that we should be paying attention to. He has a very storied academic career. I won't give you all the details, but he did teach for 10 years at the University of Alabama, so we might get a roll tide out of him while he's up here. He's also a leading authority on the 18th century moral philosopher Adam Smith, who's known as the father of economics. And a lot of what we enjoy today in the modern world as a result of the technology that we have and the standard of living that we enjoy is due to the Western world's learning to some extent the lessons that Adam Smith had to teach. And Professor Otteson is going to share with us today some thoughts about the relevance for Adam Smith today. You may have seen some of the flyers around campus or as you entered the gym advertising a full-length lecture that he'll be doing this afternoon in the Lester Chapel at 2 o'clock, and you're all welcome to come out to that. I hope we can have as many people as possible come for that. The topic for that lecture is Adam Smith and social justice. Social justice is an important phrase that's been on the lips of many people recently, and Professor Otteson is going to let us know what the intersection of Adam Smith's thought is with social justice this afternoon. This morning he'll be speaking more briefly and in more general terms. I do want to mention that his appearance on campus is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University and also the John Templeton Foundation. Please help me in welcoming Dr. James Otteson.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you for the shout out about the University of Alabama. It was recently a few dark days in Alabama's history, but we'll try to get over that, pass over it in silence. It's an honor and privilege to be here addressing you this morning. I wanted to talk a little bit about Adam Smith and Christianity. Have you heard of Adam Smith before? If you've heard of him, if you haven't read him or if you haven't heard him discussed in classes, you might have heard of him as the author of the very influential book that came out in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations. 1776 was an auspicious year. That was also the year, of course, when David Hume died. Is that what you were thinking? It is the year David Hume died. Also the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Smith's often credited, as was just mentioned, as being the founding father of the discipline called economics, and his book, The Wealth of Nations, is often credited as being the founding document, as it were, for a system of political economy called capitalism. Now, that's despite the fact that the word capitalism never actually appears in anything that Adam Smith wrote. That word capitalism was popularized by another political economist named Karl Marx. You may have heard of him. Karl Marx called it capitalism because he thought it was something like a disease. But if you've heard anything about capitalism, we'll use the term, you've probably heard that it is an immoral system, or at the very least maybe an amoral system, a system without any kind of morality. Many people claim that socialism is a morally preferable system if only we could live up to its ideals. So perhaps some say that capitalism is necessary to deliver the goods, as it were, but many believe that if it is necessary, it's a necessary evil. But here's a curious fact. Adam Smith, the supposed founding father of the supposedly evil system of capitalism, was a Christian. So evidently, at least he believed that that the system of political economy that he was recommending was consistent with Christianity. So this raises an interesting question, not just for scholars, but for us today. How could a Christian be in favor of capitalism? Or maybe to put it a little bit differently, how do markets and morality mix? We should probably start with defining. Let me define terms. What do we mean by capitalism and what do we mean by socialism? Those words are used in many different ways by many different people. Capitalism, as envisioned by Adam Smith, was a system of political economy in which individuals had strong property rights and in which they had the freedom to buy or sell, to trade, to exchange, cooperate, and to give according to their own judgment. It's a system based on what we might call decentralism. Economic decisions are made by private individuals in voluntary association with others, with little or no interference from uninvited third parties. By contrast, socialism is a system of political economy based on centralism. Property is owned collectively or by the state, so there's little or no private property, and decisions about how to use or distribute resources are typically made centrally by state officials or experts. So under the Smithian decentralist system, justice, and I'll talk more about this afternoon, but I'll just mention it now. What justice means is the protection of individuals' persons, meaning protections from murder, assault, slavery, protection of individuals' property and possessions, and protection of people's voluntary promises and contracts. By contrast, under the centralist system, justice means enforcing a material equality among people and providing them with the means necessary to lead the lives they would like to lead. So while the decentralist conception of justice requires the state to protect people from violence, invasion, theft, fraud, etc., but to do not much else, under the centralist system, justice requires the state to act in a more activist role by redistributing wealth to people according to its vision of the common good. So, ladies and gentlemen, which is better, the decentralist system or the centralist system? That's the big question, isn't it? Well, it depends on what you're measuring. So if the measurement is material prosperity, if that's the criterion by which to judge, then the decentralist model wins hands down. Over the 2.5 centuries since Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the countries that more closely approximated the recommendations he gave have outperformed those that have not by large margins. And that's whether measured by income, by wealth, by longevity, infant mortality, access to health care, and many other ways. And the numbers really are startling. I'll give you just a couple of them. Since 1980, just 1980, the number of people worldwide living in absolute poverty, which is typically defined on living on about $3 per day. So just imagine trying to lead your life on only $3 for all of the things you need per day. So since 1980, the number of people living at that level has declined from 1.6 trillion people on Earth to 800 million. So that means that in just the last 37 years, some 800 million people have risen out of grinding poverty. In 1820, fully 94% of all people on Earth lived at that level. Today, 9.6%. So we went from 94% to 9.6%. Now the bad news is, the good news obviously is that for billions of people, they now lead a life that is not beset by grinding poverty. The bad news is we still have 800 million or so people to go, so we've got a long way. Now the question is, what caused this growth and prosperity? Economic historians now largely agree, I think, that it's been principally due to the rise and spread of institutions that protect private property, that allow free trade, migration, that honor voluntary promises and contracts. These institutions were largely unheard of before the 17th century, and it wasn't until the 18th and the 19th centuries that they really began to pick up steam. And as they did, they enabled growth in wealth and prosperity of places like Great Britain and America. Then in the 20th century, that began to spread to other places around the world with similar effects. But here's an interesting historical question. This is just something for you to think about. Why did those institutions emerge when and where they did, as opposed to some other place or some other time in human history? Think about this for a second. If you could go back in time to the year 1000, AD 1000, and you surveyed the world then, and someone asked you to predict where on the globe would there be a dramatic increase in prosperity, what country would you have picked? Well, it wouldn't have been Britain, wouldn't have been America. What would it have been? It clearly would have been China. China was the clear leader. China had a sophisticated culture and language and literature. It had technology and science, including fireworks and firepower. It had natural resources, land, people, many of the things that people think are the necessary ingredients for prosperity. The Song dynasty at its height was the then pinnacle of human civilization, and yet generalized prosperity did not ensue. Why not? Or if you go back a little bit further in our human history, think of the Roman Empire before and after Christ. Think of the pharaohs, even further back, who built the pyramids. It took a lot of capital to build for the Roman Empire to build the aqueducts and the roads and the Colosseum. It took a lot of capital to build those pyramids. Why wasn't there generalized prosperity? Of course, the emperor and the Caesar and the pharaoh, they were rich, but not very many other people were rich. So how were they able to do it? Well, how did the pharaohs build the pyramids? How did the Romans build the Colosseum? They built it with slave labor. So that's one way to get rich, isn't it? To steal it from other people. And that really, in some sense, is the tried and true human historical way. We might call this extraction, but that's not building generalized wealth. Imagine somebody who goes to a beach and builds a big sandcastle, and after he's done building the sandcastle, points to it and says, "Hey, look at all that new sand I built." No, there's no new sand. It's a nice sandcastle, but you just took sand from other places and piled it up in one place. That's what extraction can look like. If you take other people's wealth, including their human labor, and pile it up in one place, it can look like wealth, but it's not genuine wealth. It's what economists call a zero-sum game. You take something from one place and you add it someplace else. You add those two together, and what do you get? Zero. That's a zero-sum game. By contrast, what began to happen in the 17th and then the 18th and 19th centuries was a slow and fitful and sometimes painful transition to a different way of interacting with others. Instead of the powerful simply taking whatever they wanted from the less powerful, they began to think of people in different ways, and if they wanted something, they began to make them offers. And those offers were offers that the other people could refuse if they wanted. If you wanted someone to do work for you, you had to offer them a wage. If you wanted what other people had, you had to offer to buy it or trade for it. That difference is simple, yet it's profound and has very far-reaching implications. Think about it for a second. If you go into Starbucks and you say you want the super big pumpkin spice mocha double latte, and they say, "Great, that'll be $7. You give them $7, they give you your drink. Here's a pop quiz question for you. Which one of you benefited from that exchange?" Somebody shout out the answer. You both did. Very good, you pass. Nicely done, Professor. You both did. And we know that's the case because if either one of you didn't think you would have benefited, you would have said, "No thanks," and gone somewhere else. That's what economists call a positive sum game. Both sides benefit from the exchange. And it's true generally for all mutually voluntary transactions. Now consider the implication. The more positive sum transactions there are in a society, the more generalized benefit there is. The more we have those kinds of rewards from those transactions, they begin to crowd out the zero-sum transactions, and you replace the extraction of wealth with cooperative generation of wealth. That, in a nutshell, is the story of what economic historian Deirdre McCloskey calls the Great Enrichment. The unprecedented and spectacular wealth that we have seen created in the world over the last couple of centuries is due principally to the growing presence of mutually voluntary, mutually beneficial transactions that have crowded out the zero-sum transactions. And what a boon it has been for so much of humanity. I gave you a couple of statistics a minute ago, but let me just give you one more comparison to really anchor this in your mind. In 1800 in America, so right after the founding of the United States, in 1800, the total population of the United States was, of what's now the contiguous United States, was 5.3 million people. That's about equivalent to what we have in the state of Alabama now. That was the total population. Life expectancy at birth, does anybody want to take a guess? Life expectancy at birth in America in 1800 was 39. 39. That means for the students here, you're already middle-aged. And what was the gross domestic product per capita? It was $1,343 per person in contemporary dollars. $1,343. Compare that to America in 2015. What do we have in 2015? Now we have a population of 320 million. Life expectancy at birth has risen to 80 and gross domestic product per capita has skyrocketed to $55,800 in constant dollars. So while the population grew 60 times over, life expectancy doubled, and real wealth per person increased by an astonishing 40 times. In a real sense, ladies and gentlemen, we are blessed to be living at the most prosperous time in human history. Okay, so what does all this have to do with Christianity? Well, the first thing to say is that the political economic system that Adam Smith described has benefited, in material terms at least, humanity more than any other system that has been attempted. And the primary beneficiaries of that system have been the poor. Remember, the Caesar, the Pharaoh, the emperors, they were already rich. They weren't the ones who benefited most from being liberated from things like slavery and invasion and violence and theft and fraud. Those beneficiaries were the common people. Now, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me." One way I would like to propose for your consideration, to heed Jesus' call to help the poor is to find ways to generate enough wealth to enable the poor to rise out of poverty. And that is something that Smith's political economy has done better than anything else ever discovered. But that's not the end of the story. In a famous passage, should have put it up here on the screen. In a famous passage from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, or it might be infamous depending on your perspective, Adam Smith says, quote, so just bear with me for a second, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. And we never talk to them of our own necessity, but of their advantages." Now just think about that for a second. What do you hear when you hear that passage? Do you hear selfishness? Does that sound like Adam Smith is advocating selfishness to you? That's what Karl Marx thought. When Karl Marx read Adam Smith, and he did read The Wealth of Nations, he thought that was the smoking gun. There it was, barely 10 pages into the founding document of capitalism. It's all about me. It's all about selfishness. Well, maybe. But Smith, for his part, didn't think he was talking about selfishness. He thought he was talking about something else. He thought he was talking about respect. That's slightly different. In each of those transactions, think about those transactions with the butcher, the brewer, the baker. In each of those, when you address yourself to the interest of the butcher, the brewer, the baker, what you're doing is acknowledging them and their interests as equally as important as you and yours. Because in each of those transactions, you're giving each other what we might call an opt-out option, meaning each of you can, if you like, say, "No, thank you," and go somewhere else. By contrast, if I force you to exchange with me, I'm asserting my superiority over you. Even if I tell you that what I want is something, if what you have is something I really want, or maybe even that I need, what I'm saying to you in doing so is that my interests or my concerns outweigh yours. Again, it's another way of trying to assert my superiority for you. What Adam Smith is advocating then is a profound equality among persons. None of us is inherently superior to anyone else, and we are all as equally entitled to have our interests respected as anybody else. That mutual opt-out option guarantees that. So we might call Smith's equality an equality of respect. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you a question. Where might one get the idea that every person is entitled to be respected equally with everybody else? Where would one get the idea that each of us is possessed of a uniqueness, a preciousness, a dignity that others are not entitled morally to violate? Where would we get the idea that interactions with others, exchanges, trades, associations, partnerships, marriages, and so on, should proceed on the basis of mutually voluntary consent instead of coercion? Where might we get the idea that thievery, theft, imperialism, etc. are wrong, not just because they're inefficient, but morally wrong, period? Are you searching and racking your brains historically for where we might have gotten this idea? Now, if your first thought is, well, it would violate people's rights, you're on the right track, but where did we get those rights? Did we get them from government? Well, governments have historically been one of the worst transgressors of those rights. Did we get them from nature? Maybe they're natural rights. Okay. Where did nature come from? So perhaps you see where I'm going with this? My suggestion, ladies and gentlemen, is that the core moral principle that is underlying Adam Smith's system of political economy, namely the equal dignity of every single person, comes from, should we all say it together? Christianity. Okay, or the Bible, I'll take it. That's where it comes from. I'll just give you a couple of passages. Consider this from the first letter of John. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called the children of God, and so we are. This is from the Acts of the Apostles. The Lord God gives to all men life and breath and everything. Our Lord could not be clearer. As Luke records Jesus telling us, and not one of them is forgotten before God. Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. It's one of my favorite passages. Here's from Jeremiah. We could go on. I'll give you one more. Here's from Jeremiah. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. So according to the Lord, and to Christian tradition more generally, whom does God value? Which of his creatures has dignity? The answer is all of them. And why? Because each of us, even the least among us, has the spark of the divine. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So my suggestion is that this conception of the inherent dignity of each individual slowly and gradually won converts. And as it did, it inaugurated new ways of thinking about and associating with other people. Think one more historical example. Think of the first arguments in human history that were made against slavery. Who made those arguments? Christians. In America, it was the Quakers in the late part of the 17th century. On what grounds did they make those appeals? On the premise that all human beings were children of God and thus deserved respect. Here's how the historian James Stewart captures the early abolitionists' thoughts. All people were equal in God's sight. The souls of black folks were as valuable as those of whites. Hence, for one of God's children to enslave another was a violation of the higher law, even if it was sanctioned by the Constitution. Just think about that. Which law comes first, the higher law or the Constitution? Which one trumps which, the higher law or the Constitution? And not to belabor the point, where does the higher law come from? Okay, so let me conclude my short presentation here this morning. We began by asking how Adam Smith could be both a capitalist and a Christian. His answer was that an economy that was based on respecting the lives, dignity, and choices of every individual, even the least among us, was required by the Christian belief in the inherent dignity that we have as children of God. The increasing material prosperity to which such a system of political economy could lead would also, he predicted, improve the conditions of the poor to levels that would free them to lead the lives of meaning and purpose that poverty would otherwise prevent. For Adam Smith, then, a decentralized economy of free enterprise would lead to both prosperity and dignity. What more moral or more Christian system of political economy could there be? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Professor Otteson. Again, please bear in mind the invitation to join us in the Lester Chapel at 2 o'clock to hear more about Adam Smith and the idea of social justice. A lot of us are concerned. President Williams has told us we need to be concerned with the poverty in the society that we see around us. And Professor Otteson has just shared with us the most successful strategy in world history for lifting people out of poverty. And we'll be talking more about that this afternoon. Thank you all for your attention. You're dismissed.